little bit about her. She's the author of 3 books of popular science: Toxic Truth, which told the story of how a scientist and a doctor risked their careers and reputations to sound alarm bells about how lead was contaminating the environment and endangering children. And then there's a book called I Can Hear You Whisper, the story of your investigation into hearing, sound, brain, plasticity, and deaf culture after learning my youngest son couldn't hear. And now this book is Friendship, the Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. So, my first question is, what is a social brain? Because you talk about that a lot.
Oh, gosh, okay. We're going to get right into it. The social brain is just a sort of umbrella term for the circuits in our brains that handle all kinds of social interaction, from sensory processing when we are listening to other people, looking at other people, and then, of course, making sense of other people. So things like theory of mind and empathy that require our ability to appreciate that other people have perspective that's different from ours, and that they could have other beliefs and things like that. All of that is part of the social brain, and there is a lot more to it than that, but it's something that neuroscientists have come to appreciate much more in say the last 20 years, in addition to studying things like cognitive neuroscience and thinking about learning and memory. They've realized that really the majority of what our brain is doing a lot of the time is processing other people, everything we know about other people.
Okay. So, why did you write this book?
That's where I thought we were going to start. Okay.
I have my questions out of order.
Out of order. There we go. Okay. So I am also, we didn't say in the introduction, but I'm a contributing editor at Scientific American, and I primarily cover the brain and psychology, although not entirely. I'm branching. My current story in the magazine right now is about is a pharmaceutical story of all things, but it has to do with neurodegenerative disease. But as someone covering the brain, I spent a lot of time at neuroscience meetings, and I got really interested in the fact that even the fact that there existed a subfield called social neuroscience. And so about 5 years ago, I went to my first social neuroscience meeting, and it was fascinating. And I realized that in addition to all the other ways in which these neuroscientists were thinking about mapping the connections inside of the brain, they were also thinking about mapping connections outside of the brain, and the way that the people in our lives have a physiological effect on us. And thinking about this biology, and then at that same meeting, I realized there were evolutionary biologists, there were primatologists, there were all kinds of different disciplines represented, and I just thought that there was this piece of all the relationships and social behavior they were talking about. I was most surprised to hear them talking about friendship. It's just not what you think about when you think about neuroscience generally, and that felt to me like something that might be interesting to other people, that there might be a piece to this thing that is so familiar, friendship, that, am I doing that by?
No, that's it.
So anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I thought there was something new, you know, when you listen to scientists talk to each other and they seem excited and they're saying, you know, nobody's really, this thinking about biology and evolution in terms of, you know, when you're thinking about friendship is a new thing. And you should just hold it right up to your, yeah?
I will.
Right. So that's why.
All right, so here's a question that I'm kind of interested in. It seems that women have lots of friends, they're in book clubs. I don't know, I have no friends who are in book clubs, male friends.
I do.
Okay.
A few.
My mother, when she lived in her community center, she played cards every day, she did all these, you know, all these things. I read this essay in my 20s called The Loneliness of Being Male. And it talked about how Men remember a great teenage friend, or friends in college, or friends in sports, friends in war, and that later on, their only friends are who they meet through their wives, who they don't really consider as deep friendships. And we talked about Saturday Night Live. He joked about that. He said that Jesus was the exception.
I don't know who watched Saturday Night Live on Saturday, but the comedian John Mulaney was the guest host, and he did in his monologue a whole bit about how men between 60 and 75, also known as his father's generation, didn't have any friends. They had their wives, friends, husbands, which was not the same thing in his. So your question is this true, or what is there hope for men? Is that your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, he also talked about Jesus saying that he was one of the exception because he had 12 friends.
Exactly. And they went fishing every day.
They went fishing.
It's very funny. You got
He did miracles for them. They went out from his high school. He met them when he was 30. And it kind of ended on a sad note. But anyhow, but he's the only successful man to make friends on his own. So I guess, is it true that women are better at getting friends and maintaining them than men, and why?
It is true that there are some stereotypes out there, and there's some truth to the stereotype. So the stereotype is that women do friendship face to face, they talk all the time, and that men do friendship side by side. So they do things together, they play sports together, they maybe sit on bar stools next to each other, they watch sports together. I know there are plenty of men who don't like sports, but that comes up a lot in the studies of these things. But the thing is, so there's some truth to that, but what I find more interesting is that there's a bunch of new research that I cite that actually finds far more similarities in how men and women think about friendship than it does differences. And that if you ask men how they value friendship, they value it in the same way that women do. They do it differently, and so I think it is true culturally that I think men have not always been encouraged as adults to spend time with their friends or to value that, and that the concerns about well, honestly, a fear of homophobia and things like that often stops. I was just listening to a podcast interview about this, about how young boys who show their sort of love and affection for each other then tend to have a kind of hashtag response at the end just to kind of indicate, but that doesn't mean I'm gay thing. And that's a shame. That's telling us that culturally we are sending absolutely the wrong message. That said, I have 3 sons and a husband, and all 4 of them have really, really close male friends. I talk about them in the book. Of course, I don't have any girls to give us examples in the book, so I would start. But the truth is that my boys, for them, friendship has been a critical piece of their lives, and that I think that I don't see that changing as they go forward, because I do think a lot of it has to do with how you're taught to value it early on. But the last thing I want to say is that I think women are doing men a disservice right now, in that we often tend to think that the only way to interact closely with a friend is the way we do it, that we're doing it right, and that talking about your emotions all the time is the only thing that counts as an intense friendship, and I don't think that's fair or right. And in fact, some of the researchers I talked to said that there are a lot of different ways of building and maintaining friendships, and so so I think we should give men are not quite the duds of friendship that we often make them out to be societally.
Chris Rock talks about how his wife said, I think you're going to like, we're going to another couples, and I think you're going to like the guy. He likes basketball like you, and he also likes the same music groups that you do. And he said, are you making a play date for me? So that's kind of the stereotype.
That is. And in fact, on my book tour, I did an event in Washington, D.C. with some friends, a couple that are good friends, And then he and I went to college together. She and I didn't. So then he came to the event the next night so that we could meet up with our college friends. And the wife was really saying, "This is great, Lydia. You're taking him out and making him see his friends." And apparently he wasn't doing a lot of that without me there. So yes, there's some of that. But it's also true that spouses on both sides need to appreciate that having friends outside of a marriage actually strengthens often people's emotional health and intelligence, and is a good thing, and that time should be made for that.
Another thing, I remember my mother when I was 15 said, all your friends, they're about the same height as you. And I said, well, a lot of them are also named David, because David was a very popular name when I was born. I had 3 friends in high school named David. My first 2 college roommates were named David, and made things easier. But you talk about that in your book, that people tend to select friends who are kind of look like them a little bit.
Well, similarity is fundamental to friendship, and it has been forever. I mean, Aristotle and Socrates talk about that, and Aristotle did his philosophizing on friendship is some of the more profound, and it has in fact colored how we think about friendship ever since. And he recognized things like similarity and proximity as mattering. Doesn't have to be the same name, but it is true. My sister-in-law's name is Jennifer, and 5 of her best friends were Jennifer as well, so it happens in various generations. There were no other Lydias when I was growing up, and there are now. But so similarity, though, can mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't just mean that we have to be friends with people who are just like us. It means that we have a little bit of a head start there, but there are a bunch of different elements to friendship that are required, and in fact, it has a little less. I mean, so it's true that a lot of my good friends are middle-aged mothers who have creative jobs, and we that makes sense. We have a lot to talk about. But I also have a lot of other friends who do other things. So diversity of friendship is important. Personality has a little bit to do with how willing you are to step out of your comfort zone. People who score high on openness are more likely to have friends who live further away, to have friends from different generations, to have friends who are less like them. It also a lot depends on culturally what you grew up used to. So kids in schools that are more diverse, not surprisingly, tend to have more friends who are diverse. I mean, makes perfect sense. And in that case, their similarity is that they're in the same school, right? Not maybe that they're the same race, but that they are having shared experiences in other ways. So it doesn't have, but maybe you're going to ask this question, but what's really interesting about the brand new science is that they are finding that the similarities of friendship extend all the way to the way your brain processes the world, and even somewhat to your genetics, in ways that Aristotle could never have imagined.
We couldn't ask him. So
no, well, I shouldn't say I can't know what he could have imagined. Maybe he did know. Maybe he guessed. But he certainly didn't.
My best friend is French. He grew up in France. His first language is France. His English is not so great, but when we're together, that's my, we're best. We always, since 19 when we met, we've been best friends. So Helen Fisher is here, and she talks about the primitive brain, right? And when you meet someone, you said within 10 seconds or a minute, you know right away if that's someone who you could be romantically involved with?
Yes. I mean, that's what the data is.
That's what the data is.
For people who brain scanners, study the brain circuitry.
Okay. So when you meet someone for the first time, can you tell, is this going to be my friend?
Sometimes. So I think there's a chemistry to friendship, just like there is to romance. And it is true that you can think that you're going to like somebody from the minute you meet them and that you could be friends, but you do have to put in time to actually really become friends. And that's the piece that a lot of us don't always appreciate, is how much investment of time there is.
Okay. So I also want to talk about, I have a lot of friends on Facebook. I often wonder, should I put on there, I need $20 I don't think I get too many responses. So how is digital media, I mean, we've talked about, we've had people here like Sharon Turkle saying that it's changed friendships, that a lot of people are lonelier because of social media. They feel they're missing out. They see everyone, you know. I said to a friend, "You're always on vacation." He said, "I don't post pictures when I'm at work." So, but has that changed friendships?
Actually, not as much as we think. So there's a whole chapter in the book on digital friendships, so I hope you will refer to that because there's a lot of really interesting work. And I will say that I was kind of dreading having to wade into this area when everybody said, "Oh, you're writing a book about friendship. Can't wait to hear how you're going to say that, you know, social media is ruining everything." And at first it seemed like there is just a complete he said, she said sort of science going on here. You know, one study says it helps us connect and the other says it makes us lonelier. Fortunately for me, in the last sort of 2 years, a whole bunch of new science came out that started to kind of clarify a bit what's going on. And part of what has happened is that, like anything, when there's the very first study that compared social media use and well-being, just as a big category, was in 2006. So, you know, social media is new, and therefore the science of social media is new. And not too surprisingly, the early studies were pretty blunt instruments. So they counted, everything was about how much time you spent online, and they never really asked any questions about what you were doing there or with whom. And so that meant that Skyping with your grandmother counted for the same as watching pornography or playing Grand Theft Auto. And those, I hope, those things are not the same. Demonstrably not the same, we hope. And so what's happening is that there is kind of a science of social media 2.0 that is just beginning. And there have been there's been a major meta-analysis done by a guy named Jeff Hancock at Stanford. And it's going to be published this year in Psychological Bulletin, but he's already been out talking about it, and I've seen a lot of the data. And it, for instance, takes every major study of social media use and well-being that's been done since 2006, and that was 224, I want to say, something like that, studies and hundreds of thousands of people. And what they found is that, yes, there's a few negative effects and there's some positive effects, but all of the effects are small, very small. And the one that is the biggest is positive, and it's relationships. And what that means is a couple of things. The big headlines are, if you use social media as one more channel with which to communicate with friends that you see in other ways, it strengthens the bonds. If you have a big network online, you often have a big network offline. There's more mirroring of our online and offline lives than we often appreciate. And we are smarter than to think that the reason we have the phrase Facebook friend is because that doesn't actually mean they're a real friend. And if you ask people in a study, which people have done, how many of your Facebook friends are actual friends, it's only like 30 to 40%. So we're a little smarter than we give ourselves credit for, I think. The real problem is that people need to put their phones down in person. And you know, the brain researchers here can tell you that things like eye contact prime the social brain and get you ready to communicate and interact, and you need to be present in the moment. And there's been some really interesting work, actually, with mothers and babies. A researcher at Hunter redid the still face paradigm that they had done way back in the day, but with the mother on instead of just freezing her face, she was holding up her phone. And the babies get really distressed, and that's pretty much a metaphor for what all of us do when our friends are on their phone or they're not fully present with us. So that matters, and there's a whole lot more to this story, but it just isn't as bad as on a population level as we think it is. What has to happen now is that we need to do better science that has context and content and that tells us who's at risk and also what direction the arrows are going in terms of the effect, because it turns out that it may well be, it looks like, people with depression and anxiety to begin with have that more exacerbated by social media, but people who are pretty healthy to begin with are fine. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't help the people with the problem, but it's a different problem if it's these particular people than if it's everybody.
Okay, so you start off the book with animals,
Yes.
and you're in California? Or
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico.
I was close. And
I am in California later with the monkeys, but
You're-
I start in Puerto Rico.
I think we talked when you were 2 days ago. You were in California. But anyway, so what have we learned about friendships through animals in the animal research?
Oh, so much, and that is why the book is a mix of a lot of human research, but also some animal research, because it's in studying other species and recognizing that there is friendship or something like it in many of those species, and even daring to call it that, that we came to understand that there is something deeper going on here, that this is not just a cultural relationship, friendship. I mean, yes, there are many cultural aspects to it, but it is much more fundamental, and that there's a more universal story, this need to connect, and I'll just say, as an example, for instance, there are a whole bunch of baboons in Africa that have been being studied for nearly 50 years, and they have been a crucial piece of the story, because in humans, even after we began to figure out that social relationships and health were related, or that there was a correlation anyway between how socially connected people were and how long they lived, and then how healthy they were, but everybody thought, well, that's probably social support, which means that, you know, if I'm upset, I can call my friend Moira and she'll listen, or, you know, somebody will be there to drive me to the hospital if I need to go. And that is a thing. That is true, and that matters, and you can understand why having someone around to drive you to the hospital would make you healthier and would help you live longer. But, we like to think anyway. But in these baboons in Africa, it turns out that the baboons with the strongest social bonds also live longer and have more and healthier babies and healthier lives, and baboons don't drive each other to the hospital. And so there has to be something more fundamental going on. And all the other important thing about that work is that it turned out that the strength of social bonds in these female baboons was more important even than where they sat in the dominance hierarchy, which is not at all what the primatologists expected to find when they were measuring these evolutionary things like reproductive success and longevity. And so that was really a surprise, and there was a major paper published in 2003 in Science on this, and then since then they've added to all of that. But it was that kind of moment where everyone said, okay, wait a minute, there is something else going on, this is more important, this is deeper, there's an evolutionary story, and the health part of it can be understood in part by studying animals.
Okay, so you talk about a biological need for friendship as opposed to a cultural need for friendship, and that, you go into that quite a bit. That there actually is a biological need.
That
for
there
friendship.
is a biological need. I don't say that there isn't a cultural need too, but yes,
Yeah,
there is
okay.
a biological need.
Which I don't think people realize.
That's the whole point of the book. Yes. Friendship is as important as diet and exercise for your health, but we don't treat it that way. We schedule our workouts and we worry about how we eat, but we do not necessarily make sure that we schedule time with friends. And we should. We will live longer and we will be healthier.
So why hasn't friendship been studied as much as romantic relationships, as much as marriages, as much as, you know, I mean, I saw a play about siblings. I said, I don't see plays about siblings too often. And it was very interesting. And you don't see plays about friends too much, except for, you know, jokes and stuff.
Sometimes, in fact, there was an interesting story in the New York Times last summer about all the movies about friendship that had been out recently and that were good, like Booksmart and things like that. But yes, it's always been kind of the lesser relationship.
As opposed to love.
As opposed to love. It was appreciated and considered valuable. I mean, I mentioned Aristotle before, and you know, he thought it was one of the wonderful things in life. But the critical piece that was missing was thinking it was valuable but not invaluable, right? Pleasurable but not essential. And some people think it's frivolous. but the reason it didn't get studied was in part because it took a really long time just to study relationships at all in a serious way, studying the biology of them. And then it makes sense that when you did start studying relationships, what you would, if you're thinking about biology, you would first focus on mothers and babies, for instance, or sexual relationships, because the biology is really obvious. And friendship is more complicated. It's harder to define and to measure. And of course, for science, you need to be able to measure. You need outcomes and variables and things like that. So they had to figure out what it was. But it did begin, I begin the book with John Bowlby and attachment theory, because that was really the beginning of appreciating that that relationships mattered in this fundamental way, and that not everybody understands that there was an evolutionary bent to Bowlby's work, and he was actually looking at work in animals at that time. And second, that he thought that attachment was a cradle-to-grave phenomenon, not just about mothers and babies, but that it applied to other relationships like friendship. But you see how long it's taken us to get there, and that is because friendship still felt squishy too. You know, it felt like a subject for women's magazines and things like that, and not for serious discussion. But it turns out that, I mean, it's nothing more serious than evolution, and just like there's been competition and a survival of the fittest, although Darwin didn't ever really call it that, but there's also been survival of the friendliest, quite literally, and that's part of it's competition and cooperation. And I think that's a story for everyone.
So, okay, so I don't like to talk about Donald Trump, but I will, because I've lost some, you know, I've seen people, I don't know if you have, but I've lost some friends who are Trump supporters, which I'm not, and I don't remember that in the past with any other president. And I'm just wondering, so why do you think that's such a deal breaker?
Because shared worldview
Okay.
turns out to be one of the most important things. We talked about similarity earlier,
Right.
but shared
Differences,
worldview is a really critical piece of that. And so I think that this is as fundamental a split in what your priorities, which thing you prioritize, as there probably has been. And also, I mean, you know, I'm not a political reporter, I'm not a political commentator, but it doesn't take, I mean, you can be an amateur and you can see that we are more polarized than we've ever been, but the result of that is that there is more, on both sides, everything is more extreme, and so it's just harder to meet in the middle, and you do need to meet in the middle to not think that the other side is evil. I will also point out that Donald Trump doesn't actually have any real friends, so, just saying.
I want to take questions from the audience. So if you, David, can you stand up and just talk?
I read someplace that the reason women are more social than men is that they have the same sex as their mother. Does this make sense to you?
I think Freud said that.
Well, that did not come up in the work that I did, and I also, so I don't actually buy it at all. I mean, somebody can fact check this and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think culturally women are trained to be social for sure, and to care and to be nurturers, and I think there's got to be some biology to that nurturing, but men are totally capable of nurturing as well, and of love. And interestingly, historically, way back, men thought that they were the ones capable of great friendships and that women didn't have the capacity for it. So, the pendulum has swung the other way. I'm talking about before Freud, that era, although there may have been people since then. But so I think all of that stuff about men and women is mostly cultural, really, honestly. The other thing I'm just going to say is that those baboons I was mentioning, one of the things that really changed and then allowed them to see how important social bonds were was when they started focusing on the female baboons, because before that, and other primates as well, before that the attention was always on the males because that seemed like that was where all the action was. There was a lot of sex and fighting and noise, right? But they realized that no, maybe not, that these females are the ones raising up these babies, and that would matter more for the next generation. So they discovered all that. But then after they discovered the importance of social bonds, they went back and started looking at the males more carefully. And guess what? They found that they have social bonds too. They just weren't as obvious, you know, you had to be looking for them. It's a bit like lead in my first book. If you're looking for it, you see it. If you're not looking for it, sometimes you don't. Yeah.
And then next, and then Jessica?
Is there any potential evolutionary cost? Like, let's say now I've suddenly developed the ability to make friends, then I'm putting my energy on people that are kind of outside my family members, not connected directly to raising the next generation, ensuring my survival. Why would this kind of arise, or and why would it be evolutionarily successful?
Reciprocal altruism is part of it, is a big piece of it, and so that drive to connect and to belong does extend outside the family. It's true that it's critical, and of course, natural selection says that you're advancing your kin too, even if they're more distant kin. But one of the things that the theory of reciprocal altruism, so that for those who are not familiar, one of the kind of holes in evolutionary theory was trying to understand why someone would do something really, someone or some creature would, for instance, why would a bird give a warning call that meant that that bird was at more risk of dying and saving the other animals if they were not kin? And why would a person jump in a lake to save a drowning stranger? And what could explain, evolutionary theory didn't seem to explain altruism, pure altruism. And so back in the 60s, 70s, Robert Trivers at Harvard came up with the theory of reciprocal altruism, which is complicated, but it basically says that the costs and benefits have to shake out, that there have to be more benefits than costs, but that there can be, and that his model predicts all kinds of emotions, and it predicts friendship, among other things. It says that the big issue is cheating, is worrying about whether you're going to be taken advantage of ultimately. And so that's why we have sort of judgment and fairness and concerns about, and that's why maybe if somebody turns out to be a really selfish friend all the time, we spend less time with them. I mean, that would fit his model. But the other piece of it is that it turns out that, so let's say you're a baboon in Africa wanting to raise up your babies, and your sisters and mother all get killed by lions, which happens. You need help, and so what they do then, so baboons do tend to hang out mostly with their family, but if in the absence of family, they will work really hard to make strong social bonds with non-relatives, and then they still do well. So from an evolutionary point of view, it would seem that there's something in it for them, right? There's more to it, but...
Jessica?
Thank you, Jessica Siegel. I've also written about primates and those very baboons.
Yeah.
I've been disturbed lately by coverage of the loneliness question. There was a piece that appeared in the AARP, I don't know if you saw it, that sort of plucks these observational studies about loneliness out of context and has no interest in establishing any cause and effect relationship, and then seems, especially harping on men, I think kind of guilt-inducing, and says, okay, so the studies show that if you have more friends, you're going to live longer, so go get some. And go take drugs, go into therapy, and then you can get some. And it seems just ridiculous. And so I wanted to ask you if in your travels and your book you get more into the actual relationship, and I just don't think it's helpful in American society, which has had a vacuuming out of social institutions that facilitate friendship, to just say to some guy, go make some friends.
I agree that is way too simplistic of an answer, and it doesn't work. And so at the last chapter of my book, so my book does two things. It takes the storyline, some of what we've already talked about, of how it was that we came to appreciate friendship and what we've learned, and especially why we understood that it affected health, and then also so the evolutionary piece, the health piece, and then also what it looks like across the lifespan. And so the last chapter is about the last part of life, but also then, of course, sort of summing up, well, what are we going to do about this? And the answer basically is yes, that individuals should take this to heart, because I do feel that a lot of people have come to believe that this isn't that important, or that it can drop down in priority. So there's that message. But a larger message is that as a community, we actually should be changing our policies. I mean, that's what the social epidemiologists I spoke with, some of whom were the ones who sort of developed this whole line of research in the beginning, in the 70s, say now, like Lisa Berkman at Harvard, that we as a society have to be mindful of bringing back some of those institutions that help make it easier for people to connect, and that we should be making decisions based on getting people together. So for instance, the military should be considering more than they do how often they move families around, things like that. So that there are policy elements to this science that are important. It's also, I mean, one problem is that we've got clarity now about, so I do, by the way, in the book, I don't debunk the science of loneliness, because of course that's what I'm arguing, that what we now understand about how much of a physiological response it is really critical. But a lot of those stories about loneliness hinge on this one big study that seemed to show this threefold increase in the number of people who don't have, well, that study is not actually
Threefold increase
in the number of people who had no
no
close
one
friends,
to call,
no
like
one to
none of
call.
the-
So,
yeah.
but it was actually, it turned out that wasn't quite right. And so that study that is at the heart of most of those stories, even today, and this study came out a while ago, but it's a methodology problem, kind of. That so part of it is that they were taking the general social survey from, I forget now the exact years that they were looking at, but so the question asked was, how many of you have, how many people did you discuss important matters with in the last 6 months, I think? And some people said, and so it jumped from something like 8% to 24% who said, oh, nobody. Or how many people did you discuss? They said nobody, but then later it turned out that some of them didn't have important matters to discuss, or that they had changed the question, and that there were these methodological problems. That's the simple version, but it's not that it wasn't going up. It is, and it's not that loneliness is not a public health issue. It's an enormously important public health issue, but that sort of threefold increase just isn't there. It went from 8 to 12%, and now it's going back down again.
There's a minister of loneliness in England.
In England, there is, and that is as it should be. So it is a health matter, but it isn't quite. So I agree with you in saying, I bring that up to say that I also take issue with some of the ways that loneliness gets talked about too simplistically in the media. I mean, and you know, it's fair that I'm sure I'm guilty of it too. I don't even know when I'm citing a study that turns out to have been, you know, not so good. Like, we all do that, because how can you know if you're not really spending 3 years digging down into the research? But the problem is we've gotten clarity about what the problem is, what, you know, that people do need to connect. The same person, Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young, who has done the most famous meta-analysis now about the problems of, or how much your survival increases by being socially connected, has been trying to do the same meta-analysis about what works as an intervention, and there's no clear answer so far. So that's a problem.
Have they determined a physiological relationship? Because you always have the issue that depressing, nasty people have fewer friends.
Yeah, no, we're
And
past
so-
that. That
okay,
is
where
not,
are we at with that?
whether, if you're socially connected on the one hand or lonely on the other, it will affect, and they have shown cause in multiple cases. Cardiovascular functioning, immune function, stress responses, cognitive health, mental health, even the rate at which your cells age is you biologically age faster if you're lonelier. And we're still, the work is still ongoing on several of those fronts to understand more about what it is, but just to take the immune system as one example, when they ran genomic tests on blood samples from really lonely older adults and older adults in the same study who were very socially connected, what popped up was a set of white blood cells, basically, in the immune system the short version is the lonely people were far more susceptible to inflammation and viruses because the gene expression had changed in their immune system. And the socially connected people, their gene expression was different, so they were much more resilient to inflammation and to
But we
viruses.
don't know which caused which, because it may very well be that the underlying
And so then
physiology,
in monkeys,
you have to switch it up.
they've done a whole lot of work to dig into that, and they have found, so they've named this response now something called the conserved transcriptomic response to adversity, CTRA. I think I got that right. And they have since found it. So it was first identified when studying loneliness, but they have since found it in people with extreme poverty, people with extreme trauma, child soldiers in Africa, things like that. So that might make you say, oh, well, okay, but then loneliness is not so bad. No, loneliness is right up there with all of these other much more dramatic seeming experiences. And so, anyway,
So,
read, there's a lot more in the book.
so I wrote an article called "The Secrets of Healthy People," and after I wrote my editor said, "How come some really nasty old people who just scream and yell all the time live all that long?" I don't know. But anyways, Susan Fisher has a question.
Yes.
No, so one thing, we have two millennial sons, and they have completely different temperaments. One is a consensus builder, one just likes to do his own thing. Going to a meeting practically gives him hives. But, you know, he doesn't want to spend his time building consensus, he just wants to do what he wants to do. But he's the one who said to me, Mom, you trained me a certain way, but your worldview is so off for my generation. Nice people finish last. Or nice people don't get to the top. And he has given me so many examples. My other son, I consider also very nice, and as I say, he's the consensus builder. I always say, so how is it working for Matthew, who is a decent person? But it is kind of interesting because they have different temperaments. But it does have something to do with being able to make friends, and there's some element that capitalism and consensus building and that ability to be whatever it is, there's some aspect that they're at cross purposes.
So I think what you're all asking me is, how is it that jerks can get to the top?
How is it, no, the reverse. How is it that there are so few nice people at the top?
At the top.
You know, the reality is when you look around, there really are
so
so
you're
few nice
talking
people.
about at the top of a certain thing, at the top of capitalism, on some levels.
Capitalism in large part because our country is sort of funneling what is.
So you're talking about corporate executives, basically?
But, you know, in a lot of other fields too.
Well, so this could be a longer discussion, but I'm going to say just a couple of things. One is that it is true in evolution and natural selection that there's always more than one strategy to success. What all this work seems to be bearing out is that the much better strategy is to be a connector and socially, to make friends, and that. But that doesn't mean it's the only way to get there. Now, the thing is, if you maybe a bunch of you are familiar with the Harvard study of adult development. So it's the really long-running study of, it was students at Harvard starting in the 1930s and then some young men from Boston. And they were followed for the duration of their lives. They're now studying the second generation and even the third generation of these people. And so that, kind of like with the baboons and the monkeys, in humans it's much harder to have these really long-running studies where you can look at all the elements of somebody's life and then you can sort of try to make some predictions, which is why we need that work in animals, actually, because it's easier to do. But in these humans, really interestingly, in all of these men who lived into their 80s, they were able to go back and they were able to look and see what they were like at 50. And the thing that most predicted how healthy you were at 80, healthy and happy, was not your professional success or your wealth or your cholesterol level. It was how satisfied you were in your relationships at 50. So the biggest predictor of your health and happiness at 80 was your satisfaction with relationships at 50.
Okay, sadly, for most of the people in this room, that moment has passed.
It's not too late. It is not too late. It's never too late. And I do think that adults think it's hard to make friends, and sure it is. But part of it is we have to be motivated to do it. We do have to work at it. We have to put ourselves in places where we have a shot, and not just sort of think, well, you know, it was so much easier when I was in school. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question that may seem scientifically naive, but I mean, you keep on saying there's an evolutionary advantage.
Mm-hmm.
People want to be happy, right? Friendship adds to happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have to use the Darwinian explanation when the fact that people want to love and be happy, I mean, it's just part of human nature.
Well, part of it is that, yeah, sure. And so some people say, well, you know, this is obvious. Of course we knew this. I argue, first of all, we didn't know that because look back at Bowlby, was nearly run out of town on the rails when he said that attachment and affection mattered so much. So we haven't always known it. But I think the real reason that we need to know that there's an evolutionary piece to it is that partly because if you want to look at solutions to problems that come out of this, so people who are not connected, like you need to know whether it's a cultural problem or a biological problem or something deeper.
Could be a
the solution,
spiritual problem.
it could be, but the fact, but there are these, the fact that this exists in all these other species is just tells us that there are some different solutions to some of the problems that arise.
Well, right, but if you say that all life is one at a fundamental level, then you could have a spiritual explanation, which I think would be more complete than a Darwinian. But anyway, that's a big discussion.
Right.
I'd just like to respond to that. I mean, there's payoffs for friendship. You live longer, you're probably going to be better
You're
at
happy.
providing for children and grandchildren, and you're spreading your DNA.
Absolutely.
And that's the Darwinian, aspect of it.
You're happier, and that's like so much more.
But there are actual benefits that are measurable.
And don't we hold to the
I'm
Darwinian
gonna-
You go.
I'm going to play contrary on this. Based on some personal observations with having a teenage boy and a teenage daughter.
Mhm.
And certainly, now maybe the nature of friendship evolves and changes, but with teenage girls, they are not friends always to add to each other's happiness. And anyone who's ever had a teenage girl,
The difference between boys and girls'
and
friendships is
even
enormous.
having lived in country Burbia, in Wilton, Connecticut, I could say it continues among the swimming moms, the cliques, and the friendships are sometimes more about social status than they are about helping each other out. So I'm going to play a little bit contrary about that. The other part that
What's the question?
Oh, okay. So I think that friendship is a more complex issue, perhaps. That there's that sometimes it's very contextual, and I also think it's evolving, which I tossed out also based on completely non-scientific personal observation from my, scientifically oriented 17-year-old son, who rode the school bus last week and said to me, "Mom, it's really funny," and he's not the most insightful kid, love him dearly, and he said, "Mom," and he hadn't ridden in a while, and he said, "Mom, it's so weird riding the school bus last week because it's so quiet. No one is talking," because he couldn't manage, he didn't have a car accident. He said, "When I was riding the school bus, we were fighting, we were arguing, we were throwing things back and forth, and now the kids are just sitting there on their phones, and they're not even talking with each other," which was unusually insightful for me. Anyway, the question is, do you see the nature of friendship evolving as technology evolves, as society evolves?
No, because that's not friendship on the bus that you're seeing. So here's my answer to both of your questions is actually a little bit related. And it is that one of the things that this science is showing us is that the bonds that most have the power to pay off and to affect our biology are the quality bonds, and there's a definition for that. So they're ones that are long-lasting, that make you feel good, and that have cooperation and reciprocity in them, at a minimum. Can be more than that, a lot more in human friendship, but it's got to have those pieces, and those pieces exist in the animal research. It's a sort of fundamental to what looks like a positive bond among monkeys. It's in the to the extent that anthropologists have studied this, it's the same thing. The themes that come up the most across cultures are that friendship makes you feel good, that it has a willingness to help, especially in time of need, and that there's same kinds of themes. And if you ask a 3-year-old, what is a good friend? The 3-year-old will tell you that they play with you, they share with you, and they don't hit you. Which is true. And it is true. So as we get older, we get more complicated and more complex in our understanding. But so, short version of my answer is that those close relationships are not changing. And what people need is, one, the step change, the really important step change for their biology is from 0 to 1 friend. Doesn't mean that you don't benefit from having more. So I would argue that those swim moms, I hope that's not their only social outlet. Or if it is, and that's how they're behaving, then they're missing out on this important thing. But having these close friends, he's also had his hand up from the very beginning over there, so I...
Okay, go ahead. This is good. And then we'll have one more question after that.
First of all, I know
My friend.
you're wearing a pair of very handsome friendship bracelets.
I am.
And I was wondering whether they came before the book or after the book.
Oh no, this is my little, so that's the DNA friendship bracelets that are on the book cover. And I got some made because I thought they were so cool. And so no, it was the book jacket artist who came up with it.
The real question was, since we know that there are strong links between infant attachment and affiliation later on, wouldn't it make very good sense to mount some kind of intervention for expectant parents so that they sort of know what might be a good thing?
I think so. I mean, I think we're already trying to do some of that. My argument, which is the thing I think we are paying less attention to, is that beyond, yes, of course, those very, very early months and years are critical. But where I think we really fall down is, if we're talking to parents, is that we tend to push achievement, and we tend to assume that kids are managing their friendships or that they have it as a value. But all the science I've just told you says that the ability to make good friends and be a good friend and keep a good friend is one of the most important skills that they could have. And that when they're 80, that's what's going to have determined literally the span of their life. And we're not really explicitly saying that that matters, at least on the same level as all these other things. And we're not always modeling it as adults. And so I think that is an area where we could really do better. And, it doesn't take huge financial outlay by society to do that. It just takes the message getting around to humans.
Last question to my friend.
All right. So there are bonds between species, between humans and dogs, and cats and other animals. From what you can tell, are those true friendships, or are they some other kind of bond?
They are very powerful, positive bonds. They are not quite a friendship. And the book really is about conspecific relationships, right? Whether it's human to human, monkey to monkey, fish to fish, sheep to sheep, all kinds of things are mentioned. But it is true that people get a huge amount of. That if I look at my golden retriever's eyes and she looks up at me, I'm sure that the oxytocin is firing.
Well, I was wondering if the chemistry is similar.
The chemistry is similar, and there is work on that showing that. So yes, pets are very valuable, but there's a limit. The self-disclosure that I was saying earlier, like women's friendship doesn't have to, but the problem is that with a pet, they're really, even like a good male friendship that has all these other elements that might not have that, but they still have more than what you ultimately have in a dog.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much.